Good morning, fellow humanists. Happy Memorial Day Sunday. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. My name is Todd Kimball. I'll be your MC. Humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. And our reader this morning, one of our favorites, joining us from the Zoom audience, Mr. Laurent Beauregard.
Good. Okay, the reading this morning, it's about the writer Paul Auster, the novelist. He died about 3 weeks ago at the age of 77. Back in 2006, he was awarded something called the Prince of Asturias Award for Literature. And what I'm going to do is read his acceptance speech. Here goes. I don't know why I do what I do. If I did know, I probably wouldn't feel the need to do it. All I can say, and I say with utmost certainty, is that I have felt this need since my earliest adolescence. I'm talking about writing, in particular, writing as a vehicle to tell stories, imaginary stories that have never taken place in what we call the real world. Surely it is an odd way to spend your life, sitting alone in a room with a pen in your hand, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, struggling to put words on pieces of paper in order to give birth to what does not exist except in your own head. Why on earth would anyone want to do such a thing? The only answer I have ever been able to come up with is because you have to, because you have no choice. This need to make, to create, to invent, is no doubt a fundamental human impulse. But to what end? What purpose does art serve in what we call the real world? None that I can think of, at least not in any practical sense. A book has never put food in the stomach of a hungry child. A book has never stopped a bullet from entering a murder victim's body. A book has never prevented a bomb from falling on innocent civilians in the midst of war. Some like to think that a keen appreciation of art can actually make us better people, more just, more moral, more sensitive, more understanding. Perhaps that is true in certain rare, isolated cases, but let us not forget that Hitler started out in life as an artist. Tyrants and dictators read novels. Killers in prison read novels. And who is to say that they don't derive the same enjoyment from books as everyone else? In other words, art is useless, at least when compared, say, to the work of a plumber or a doctor or a railroad engineer. But is uselessness a bad thing? Does a lack of practical purpose mean that books and paintings and string quartets are simply a waste of our time? Many people think so, but I would argue that it is the very uselessness of art that gives it its value, and that the making of art is what distinguishes us from all other creatures who inhabit this planet. Art is essentially what defines us as human beings. To do something for the pure pleasure and beauty of doing it, think of the effort involved, the long hours of practice and discipline required to become an accomplished pianist or dancer. All the suffering and hard work, all the sacrifices in order to achieve something that is utterly and magnificently useless. Numbers don't count where books are concerned, for there is only one reader each and every time, only one reader. That explains the particular power of the novel and why, in my opinion, it will never die as a form. Every novel is an equal collaboration between the writer and the reader, and it is the only place in the world where two strangers can meet on terms of absolute intimacy. I have spent my life in conversations with people I have never seen, with people I will never know, and I hope to continue until the day I stop breathing. It's the only job I've ever wanted.
Thank you, Lawrence. Beautiful reading today, timely and thought-provoking. Thank you very much. We have co-presenters this morning, Jessie Braverman and Cody Urban from the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers. Jessie has spoken to us before, and we were so moved by the presentation that HDP became a financial supporter of the organization and their mission. The invisible migrant workers at sea carry the weight of the world economy on their backs. Jessie and Cody will discuss how to support their fight for dignity, rights, and welfare. Jessie is the chairperson of the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers. Cody is a member of the organization. Let's have a rousing ovation from our live audience at the Friendly House and a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience for Jessie Braverman and Cody Urban.
Wow, that's the most amazing introduction I've ever had. Oh man, I'm worried it'll disappoint. Yeah, can you go ahead and share the slides, Cody? Yeah, thanks so much everyone for having us and for all the support you all have given the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers so far. It's really been so supportive of our work and made a difference in the lives of the seafarers already. But really, it's honored to be here with so many people who are dedicated to social justice and bettering the lives of all people. Again, I'm Jessie. This is Cody. We're with the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers. You can call us PCCS for short. It's kind of a mouthful. But PCCS is a coalition of migrant, human rights organizations, people of faith, workers, labor unions who are all united to build solidarity with seafarers in their fight for dignity, rights, and welfare. If you hit the next slide, Cody, I think it'll show our mission and vision, but you can really see our vision is to build unity between land and sea and communities in solidarity with seafarers. We formed PCCS after years of collaboration between community organizations and trade unions to support the needs of seafarers docked at ports all along the Columbia River. So that includes Portland, but also Vancouver, Kalama, and Longview. But it was really in 2020 at the start of the COVID pandemic that we decided to launch a permanent coalition to respond to seafarers' worsening conditions during the global health crisis and really build long-term solidarity in their fight against neglect, exploitation, and oppression. So today we're excited to share just generally the conditions that seafarers are facing around the world. We'll actually do a more focused case study on the situation of Filipino seafarers, and then we'll share more about our campaigns as PCCS and what actions are people already taking to build solidarity with them. If you hit the next slide, Cody. How many people are already familiar with what a seafarer is? Okay. Oh, that's so great. But yeah, just to remind folks, I'm not sure if everyone on Zoom is raising their hand, but seafarers are the migrant workers who operate those massive ships that we see sailing into the port of Portland every day. They come from countries all around the world, but primarily from the Philippines, China, Indonesia, Ukraine, and they spend 9 to 12 months every single year living and running these vessels that sail all over the world. And while there's over 1.5 million seafarers working on vessels around the world any given day, you know, transporting all the goods and products that we use in our daily lives, they're also some of the most invisible workers in the world, right? Most people don't know what a seafarer is, let alone the hardship that they face. And so that's why we often call them the forgotten migrant workers at sea. So we're really excited to be here to share their conditions and their struggle. But with that, I'm going to pass it off to Cody to share next.
Thank you, Jessie. And to echo what Jessie said, just thank you so much for having us back to talk about this issue. Since the last time that we presented here, the conditions of seafarers haven't changed. But the amount of solidarity that has come through our coalition and through many of the partners we work with has only grown. And so I'm really hoping that as we continue to talk about the issues that seafarers are going through, all of you and many more people that you know will get involved in the fight for their rights, dignity, and welfare. And why is it that there needs to be a strong fight for the rights, dignity, and welfare of seafarers? So for one, seafarer is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. It is actually technically considered the second most dangerous job. Who knows what the first dangerous job is? I heard forestry and logging, and yes, it is logging. just because of all the accidents that come with working around falling trees. Similar to that, with seafaring, it's out in the open ocean. If anything goes wrong on the ship, your ship is your entire country that you live on, just in the borders of that ship. And if anything happens, the ship goes down, there's really nowhere else to be. It's an inherently dangerous job, and very little we can do will change that fact. It is one of the most significant industries in the world because it gets our things that we need from point A to point B. It's the reason why we can go to the grocery store and we don't even have to think, oh, are they going to have broccoli today or not? Of course they will. We have the shipping and transportation industry. So it's one of the most significant industries in the world. It's also one of the most dangerous industries in the world, but it is made so much more dangerous by the willful negligence of the shipping industry. The workers who work these cargo ships or any ships at sea should be given full protection, and it's rare that that actually happens. For example, the picture here, I don't know if y'all are familiar, I'm seeing a lot of nods here of the very tragic bridge collapse that happened in Baltimore a few weeks ago. It was a cargo ship that, unfortunately had a malfunction with the steering. It hit the bridge. And this picture is actually not from that long ago. The debris was on the bridge for weeks. Rescue forces were trying to get it out. They were actually doing controlled explosives to get some of the debris off. But the crew was forced to be on the ship the entire time. For 7 weeks, they're on the ship. And we'll get into why later on, but in short, it is because they don't have visas. It is illegal for these seafarers to leave that ship. And so they were kept in the ship as part of the property of the ship. So another example of the danger of this kind of work that is made more dangerous on purpose is the fact that we've heard from some seafarers who are in the middle of a storm, because storms come up, some of the biggest storms happen at sea, and we've seen videos of ships rocking back and forth, whole waves coming up to like the top of like the length of a 3-story building sometimes. But then one time we heard that the company told the seafarers, like, we want to make sure that the cargo containers are bolted down right. It's looking like it might be kind of weak. So seafarers were sent out in the midst of a storm, rocking back and forth to fix and check those, the holds that were holding down the cargo containers that you see up here. And unfortunately, one of them came loose and crushed a seafarer to death. So this very inherently dangerous job was made that much more dangerous because the company valued the value of the cargo over the value of the humans who are working it. That's an example of how this very dangerous job is made much more dangerous than it has to be. In addition to how the danger that these workers face when they're at sea, there is incredibly unequal wages that we can think of when we see what a seafarer earns based on what we earn with many of the jobs we can get here in the US. We've heard stories of, first of all, there's different jobs on the ship. There's different wage gaps between what kind of jobs there are. Some of the lowest paid seafarers can be paid only around $200 a month. And so this is a job that you have to go to years of schooling for. So having to actually pay for those years of schooling. We've heard stories of seafarers who have actually had to pay some of their family land back home to take out a loan just to enroll in the school to get a seafaring job. And after years of doing that, maybe they'll get a job to be what they call a wiper, which is someone who cleans out the cargo hold of a bulk carrier that is carrying maybe cement or potash or grain, and they can make as low as $200 a month. So imagine, like what Jessie said, being at sea for 9 to 12 months at a time, not seeing your family, doing whatever you can to send money home to your family because you're probably coming from the Philippines or India or Vietnam, where there's endemic poverty. and all you can make is $200 a month. And not only that, but seafarers are living where they work. They literally live in the ship. And so when the clock is stopped, technically they shouldn't be working, but nothing is there to stop a captain from forcing the worker to work longer than their contract hours. There's no regulation there. And when that happens, they are not paid. And in addition to that, we hear about wage theft. There are many companies that will try to sound like they're using like some legal framework about why they have to withhold seafarers' wages for a few months, but in reality, it's illegal. When seafarers are not given their payment after a given month, that is illegal wage theft. And again, there is no one at sea to enforce this. We've even heard stories of the company saying, oh, it's okay, there's a deferred payment, we work through a different agency. When you get back home, you can talk to this other group and collect your wages. And many a time that's just a way to avoid blame and not actually get away with not paying their workers at all. So wage theft is incredibly common, unfortunately, in this industry. There is massive abuse that seafarers face. Sometimes, a lot of times, seafarers will experience racism. Many, especially if it is a crew of Filipino or Indian seafarers and the captain is Russian or Greek, you'll see a lot of mistreatment based on ethnicity on these ships. And then many times seafarers actually stand up for their rights. Seafarers are not passive people who just realize this is their lot in life and they just have to go with it. Many seafarers advocate for their rights on a regular basis. The problem is that when they're at sea again, and your entire country is just that ship, and the captain can be technically the dictator of his own country in that ship, whatever the captain says goes. We've heard stories of seafarers who have spoken up for their rights and were thrown overboard and it was listed as an accident by the company. In working with the inspectors from the International Transportation Workers Federation, the ITF, we've heard stories of a seafarer's body that was found in the freezer for a similar speaking up for their rights and was murdered because of it. This happens a lot. And is one of the big reasons why seafarers need solidarity, because on their ships, they are facing some of the most brutal repression when they're fighting for their rights by, again, one of the most profitable industries in the world. I mentioned about the seafarers who were not able to disembark the ship in Baltimore. This is also very widespread. So the name of our presentation is Forgotten Migrants at Sea. And it's because the shipping industry specifically reaches out to workers from the global South, the Philippines, India, Vietnam, Burma, Russia and Ukraine also have a lot of seafarers coming from their countries. And that means that when they're stopping in different ports, if they're not a citizen of the country, they actually cannot step on shore if they don't have a visa. You don't need a visa to work on the ship, but you need it to disembark. And especially after 9/11, when there were more regulations put on this by the Department of Homeland Security, it became even harder to obtain visas. And actually, even just speaking about the 9/11 mentality, when we work with the port in order to get our port access badges in order to be able to access the port, in order to meet with the seafarers, the training that we go through doesn't talk about, okay, here's ways that you can interact with seafarers, here's ways to keep things safe. It's mostly about some of these seafarers could be terrorists. And so you have to know what to look for to be careful about that. So that's the framework that the security of the port has. They see the seafarers as a threat, a potential threat, before even seeing them as humans. And what does this look like? So this is just, if you look at the bottom of this slide, this gives an example of the many steps process in order to get a visa. You have to submit a petition. it goes through processing with one department. Then you have to pay a fee in order just to move it on to the next position. And then, it goes through so much bureaucratic red tape that sometimes it's so hard to get the visa application process in line before your contract starts and you have to get on the ship, that many seafarers don't do that. So what does that mean? It means when they come to port, they are not able to step off on land. If they want to go into town and get something from the store, they're not able to do that. It also means that their health can be at risk, which I'll cover on in a future slide in a minute here. But this is just to show just how, again, inherently difficult it is to get a visa, because there's so many different companies, processing agencies, the agency issuing the visa, and then the government, the different government departments too. There's many different bodies in which fee payment can be collected, and these different agencies work together to maximize what their cut of that price they can get out of it. And unfortunately, it means that for seafarers, it is such a long and stressful process, and it's incredibly expensive for them. I think I mentioned about this, the Homeland Security having a counterterrorism mindset instead of a human rights mindset when it comes to seafarers accessing into the border. And so what this also means is they can be isolated. Seafarers are isolated for months on end. And something that I'll also mention here really briefly is lack of access to healthcare. And not having a visa, not being able to access any services on land means that seafarers' lives are put at risk. There was one time that we went on a ship and we encountered a seafarer who was in the midst of a medical emergency, and the company was not allowing him to get off the ship in order to see a doctor. And he had been experiencing this for a month at this point. This is inhumane. How many seafarers have died just because there might be a hospital just a few blocks off the port and they're not allowed to access it because of our inhumane border and citizenship requirements. It is absolutely inhumane. And even when they're on the ships, they don't have access to the kind of health needs that they might have. This especially happened, we saw this during COVID-19, when we started to get involved with supporting seafarers, when we saw these are frontline workers, right? And yet they were not being prioritized in the slightest for COVID vaccinations, not by their home country governments, not by the United States government, definitely not by the shipping industries. And I think we'll talk a bit more about our vaccination campaign that we undertook because of this when I give it back to Jessie. But just to touch one more time on this slide about the isolation that seafarers face at sea. Oftentimes we go on these ship visits and we're talking with seafarers. One of the things they love to talk with us about is their families back home. They have kids, they're doing this because they can't get anywhere enough income in a job back home, say in the Philippines, because poverty and unemployment are endemic, because of a lot of the same economic and political trade deals that allow the shipping company to have so much power and allows the ship such few regulations for these shipping companies to have in labor laws. They also, it's those same laws that create such endemic poverty and unemployment back home. And we've heard stories that, a seafarer will go home and his child, who was maybe 3 months old before, is now 1. And he goes home and is so happy to see them growing up some, but the child doesn't recognize them. You have so many families who are just completely divided because of this, when they should all be together working at home. And seafaring is one of the most isolating jobs when it comes to family separation. So to talk a bit more about COVID-19, we formed the coalition back in 2020 when the pandemic hit, specifically because there's an international ban placed on crew changes. So I want us to consider the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a massive public health emergency. And how should we approach public health emergencies. We should do so to maximize public health, the health of all people, regardless of where they are in the world, regardless of their class, regardless of what jobs they have. Instead, we saw not just with the shipping industry, but with almost every industry and government around the world, is they actually switch into emergency mode to keep the economy running, to keep their profits coming in. And so instead of doing what they could, paying what costs they needed to ensure that seafarers could be prioritized for PPE, for any kind of vaccination when the vaccination came, they just shut down the ships. They said, we don't want our workers to get in contact with the virus because then we'll lose workers to work on the ships. So they placed an international ban on crew changes, and the seafarers that maybe were in their 8th month of a 9-month contract were now stuck on the ship for many more months. We met seafarers by the end of this, by the time the ban was lifted, who had been on their ship for almost 2 years. And they said it was like being on a floating prison. They were literally stranded at their ports, sometimes stranded at sea, and their governments were not working to repatriate them. And I believe when we pass it back to Jessie, we'll talk a bit more about our response to that. But there is a video here that talks about one of these issues. And this is, I'm hoping that the video worked, that the sound works here, but this is from Migrant USA, mass organization of overseas Filipino workers that made this video about seafarers on a cruise ship when the pandemic first hit. So let me just see if it works. Yeah, I don't think the sound is working. That's all good. I think I can just skip that video then, because I think in generally, the contents of the video speak to what I just spoke about. The final thing I'll talk about before I pass it back to Jessie is, how does this happen? You know, we should have regulations. These ships should be held accountable. These companies shouldn't be able to enact such systematic exploitation and abuse of their workers. But unfortunately, they do. And one of the big reasons is that when a law is passed to regulate an industry, unfortunately, we've seen more than one time throughout history that that industry will then turn around and try to find a loophole so they don't have to practice the law. For the shipping industry, this comes in the form of what we call a flag of convenience. So how it works is that a ship, when a ship's out in the open ocean, they're not in any country, right? There's no countries out in the open waters past the exclusive economic zone off the coast. So then what country's laws do you apply to the ship? Well, the way that this is meant to be mitigated is a ship has to actually register with a country, and they carry the flag of that country. So if you see a cargo ship, any of these ships out around the Willamette at the port, you'll often see many different country flags on these ships. That's not necessarily the country where the ship came from, or that the company is based in, or that the workers are based in. It just means this ship technically has to follow the law of this country whose flag is here. So what's the loophole? The loophole is you can choose the country with the lowest labor standards possible, and that's just the country's laws that you have to follow. And so there's a handful of countries that are commonly used, such as Panama. Liberia is another one, yes. Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands. These are many of the most commonly used flags of convenience because there's less labor standards for the industry to follow. So even when there is legislation attempted to be passed, even when there is international laws that are put forth, even in the UN, you're seeing this industry lobby the United Nations itself to make sure that this loophole is here that allows them to pretty much pick and choose which standards they follow. So if you ask them, you're telling them you're violating labor standards, they'll be able to tell you, we're just following the law of Panama, of Liberia. So this is how this issue is so systematic. They are organized. And so that's why we have to get organized in order to work with seafarers to fight for their rights, livelihood, and dignity. For now, though, in order to talk a bit more about why, like where seafarers are coming from and the bigger picture.
Yeah, so Cody really just shared with us the general conditions that seafarers are facing around the world, but we wanted to do a specific case study on the Philippines to really help us understand more deeply the root causes of their exploitation and oppression that they face. It's also significant because out of the 1.5 million seafarers around the world, Filipino seafarers actually make up 1/3 of the workforce of the global maritime industry. So most of the crews coming through the Port of Portland are actually from the Philippines. And this is really significant considering like the size of the Philippines in comparison to countries where other seafarers are coming from, like China or India. It's significant that they make up 1/3. Like Cody mentioned, there's often discrimination on board based on nationality or race, and seafarers from the Philippines are paid significantly less than their US counterparts and face much higher rates of exploitation. So for a Filipino seafarer, they might be paying $450 a month compared to their US counterpart who might be making $6,000 to $8,000 per month for doing the exact same job. But to understand why Filipino seafarers make up such a significant amount of the maritime industry, why are they facing this exploitation? We have to really understand the character of the Philippine economy and how this creates the conditions for what we call forced migration. Filipinos leave their home country en masse in search of work abroad. To be specific, 6,300 people migrate out of the Philippines every single day. So because of that, 10% of the whole Filipino population is actually living overseas, not actually in the country itself. And of that population overseas, 21% of them are working at sea. The way that we can describe the Philippine economy is that it's import dependent and export oriented, meaning that the entire economy of the Philippines is dependent on serving the wealthier people in the Philippines and even people and countries overseas rather than serving the Filipino people themselves. The Philippines, maybe folks are aware the Philippines is like incredibly rich in natural resources, but the people don't see the fruits of the land they live on or even their own labor. What farmers in the Philippines are creating with their own hands is taken away from them by big business owners who sell what they produce overseas at incredibly high prices that the farmers who produced it can't even afford. A story that I've heard that really illustrates this is that, you know, the Philippines is one of the world's largest rice producers, but it's also the world's largest rice importer. The farmers can't actually afford the rice they produce, which ends up being exported to other countries at higher prices. And instead, they have to buy imported rice that's been reported to have plastic in it. People have like reported that they've even been able to light their rice on fire. Yeah, even though the Philippines produces some of the most like delicious and nutritious rice in the whole world. But while the Philippines exports most of its natural resources, the country's biggest export is actually its own people. The Philippines is currently the world center for migrant labor, with people leaving the country again every single day to look for work abroad. And because of the lack of industrialization in the country, there are really limited jobs. And the jobs that are there pay very low wages, right? The minimum wage in the Philippines is not enough to support a normal average sized family in the country. And so this is why people are forced to go abroad looking for work overseas so them and their families can just survive. All of these migrants, seafarers included, are then sending remittances back to the country, which adds to up around $33 billion annually and composes 10% of the gross domestic product of the country. So it's actually one of the biggest incomes of the Philippines is the remittances sent back from migrant workers. Actually, this month I learned that seafarers are required to send 80% of their income back to the Philippines. They only get 20% of their salary on board, like in cash. And that's because when they send it back home to the Philippines, it can be taxed by the Philippine government, and it can then be used to stimulate the Philippine economy, which the government is desperate for. So with that, we can really start to understand why Filipino seafarers and all Filipino workers are called quote, the modern heroes of the Philippines, because the country literally depends on exporting its own people for its economy to be able to survive. And even though seafarers are called heroes, literally when I was in the Philippines, I saw a massive billboard on the highway in Manila that had a picture of a seafarer saying they're the modern heroes of the country. They are not actually treated like they're the modern heroes of the country. They're the least priority of the Philippine government, as they're falling prey to trafficking, exploitation, abuse, and even death. And shipping companies love to hire Filipino seafarers because of the lack of protections by the Philippine government. They can get away with paying them extremely low wages because it's still significantly more than what workers are making back home in the Philippines. And the way that this economy is held in place is through different trade and labor policies created by the Philippine government, even influenced by the US government as well. One of the main ones being something called the labor export policy, which is actually a system of policies, laws, agencies, even a culture where Filipinos are exported from the country en masse and treated as commodities. In addition, there's contractualization, where workers are treated as long-term temporary labor without job security or benefits, which also, leads them to need to seek stable employment overseas. So we can really see that the conditions of the economy in the Philippines sets the stage for the exploitation of Filipino workers and is really at the root of the exploitation of Filipino seafarers. You hit the next slide, Codes. During ship visits, people always ask seafarers, why did you decide to become a seafarer? How did you get into this career? And I would say 95% of the time, the answer is that they had no choice and they need to work overseas to support their families, right? They need to feed their children. Maybe they're sending their siblings to school. Maybe they're supporting their parents who can no longer work but had no savings or retirement, because they cannot do that working a job in the Philippines. In PCCS, when we ask ourselves the question, what can we do about all of this? Our answer is that we can fight together for lasting change. And this is really why we decided to launch the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers, to establish a permanent campaign to monitor the conditions of seafarers and advance their rights, and to mobilize the community to help meet their needs as determined by the seafarers themselves. And as PCCS, we really seek to build awareness among our communities about the situation of seafarers and the need to build solidarity in the fight for their rights and welfare. So as PCCS, our current campaign right now focuses on fighting for seafarers' right to health over profit. I think from what Cody shared is that it's really clear that seafarers are systematically denied their right to health, right? It's incredibly rare that a seafarer will see a doctor while he's on board 9 to 12 months out of a year. And even when they go home, right, a lot of seafarers are coming from countries where healthcare is not affordable or accessible for normal working people. Just a few weeks ago, I went on board a ship. You can even go back to the first slide of this case study. It was actually the ship in one of the pictures up here. Yes, this ship went recently. One of the seafarers on board, his name is Felix. He's from the Philippines. It's actually that guy in the yellow shirt right behind Cody. When I first went on board, he's what they call a mess man. So he's like the right-hand man of the chief cook who does all the cooking on the ship. The mess man is the one who's washing the dishes, cleaning the crew mess, the kitchen, even cleaning the cabin of the captain. But when I got there, this mess man had a horrible rash infection on his entire arm, so much so that he couldn't use his whole left arm to work, even though his job is washing dishes. And so he was in a lot of pain. He does not have a US visa. The company did not get him a US visa before he went on board, even though they knew he would be coming to the US. And so there was no plan to get him off the ship to see a doctor. In another instance last year, we boarded a ship and met 2 seafarers who were also suffering pretty severe medical conditions. They both had a hard time walking. One has gout. He had a gout flare up because you can't control what food you're eating on the ship, right? What you get is what you get. The food had inflamed or triggered his gout. And so his feet and his calves were so swollen, he couldn't even put his work boots on. He was having a hard time walking. The other seafarer had fallen while at sea because they were in a typhoon. The ship is like this, and he's climbing up a staircase and he fell. He hurt his back. He couldn't even put on a backpack or walk. So I got in there. Both these workers couldn't even walk, but in order for them to get a medical transport, meaning someone would drive to the ship, pick them up, and just drive them to a hospital, they charged $3,000 for that. So the company had scared them out of requesting this medical care because it's the company's responsibility to pay for that transport, since it's an injury that they got while on board at work. And so they were just planning to keep quiet because they had been so intimidated by their company. But as PCCS, we do the next one, what we call medical missions. So we'll actually go on board with volunteers who are trained to do basic medical checks for the workers on board, many of whom haven't seen a doctor in months or years. And if there's a more severe problem, we actually have a partnership with the local Filipino Nurses Association, who volunteers with us to go on board and do fuller assessments and provide any needed medical care. So for the seafarers on the ship last year, where those two guys couldn't walk, we actually brought a nurse on board. She did a medical evaluation of the two, and then we ended up providing them free transportation to the hospital where they got free medical care. And then, as you can see in these photos, Cody mentioned, our medical missions actually started with COVID vaccination campaign in 2021, as seafarers were systematically denied access to COVID vaccines. So through that campaign, we were able to vaccinate over 5,000 seafarers along the whole Columbia River. But as PCCS, our view is that the other hardships that seafarers face, like the extremely low wages or wage theft, lack of sleep from long work hours. And when I say long work hours, I mean like 24 to 48 hours working on duty without rest. Really dangerous working conditions, isolation from the rest of the world. Our view is that these also impact a person's health and well-being. So while we do provide critical services for the workers on board through the medical missions, we also believe that the fight for their right to health is related to the fight against their severe neglect and exploitation, because in the eyes of their employers or even their home governments, profit is more important than these workers' lives. And so we have to fight to assert seafarers' right to health over profit. In addition to medical missions, we regularly, like weekly, board vessels on what we call ship visits, where we actually go on board, meet the seafarers, hear their stories, witness their conditions, provide these critical services, and forge long-term relationships with the perspective of supporting the fight for their rights. We've worked with the humanists in the past to create care packages with like basic toiletries, things we might take for granted that many seafarers don't have access to. And so we actually deliver those care packages to the workers on board on every ship visit that we do. We also provide free transportations for workers to go ashore if they do have the right to shore leave in a US visa. So we escort them to go grocery shopping, to go see a doctor, pick up medications from the pharmacy, or go to the mall and just get a break from being trapped on a ship for months at a time, right? Some fresh air. We also bring them to meet with members of the community or attend community events. So you can see in these photos some pictures of Filipino seafarers hanging out at the Filipino Bayanihan Center in Southeast Portland. It's a resource center for migrants in the greater Portland area. They're also a member of PCCS. And then one of our main projects right now is that we're actually fundraising to purchase a van that we can use to escort seafarers ashore. Right now, I'm like using my personal vehicle. It's a little Nissan that I can fit 3 or 4 of them in, depending on how big they are. But you know, there's like 7 to 10 of them who want to go out at a time. And in my small vehicle, we can't accommodate it. And so we're really pushing to fundraise for a van so we can actually take 10 of them out at a time off the boat into the community. To close, I just wanted to share this message we got from a seafarer on International Seafarers Day last year. This is our friend Tyler. He is 26 years old. I guess he might be 27 years old now. He's from the Philippines. He was actually on a ship that we call a liner, meaning it traveled back and forth between China and Portland. And so we got to see him every 6 weeks. And so we were able to build a close relationship with Tyler and many of the other crew members on the ship because we saw them so regularly. But on International Seafarers Day, we did like a little selfie campaign. People held up these signs that say dignity, rights, and welfare for seafarers, and he wanted to participate and share a message for people to hear. So I can just read the message. He says, seafarers are one of the global frontliners who work to give continuous services across the world. We are essential workers providing essential services and supplies to keep the global economy alive because the shipping industry never stops. The jobs and responsibilities at work always come with risks, so we always put ourselves on safety, not just for us, but also for our family who waits for us to return. Despite rough seas, uncontrollable change of weather, hurdles and challenges that we experience on board, we stood tightly in front of all of the challenges. We wouldn't hesitate to put our lives on the line for our country and for our beloved family. Even though seafarers are some of the most essential workers in the world, they're also some of the most invisible workers. I know we keep saying that, but what is really powerful to me is that Tyler is also aware of the power that seafarers have, and not just him as an individual, but that the collective unity of seafarers and their communities and the supporters is really powerful, and that when we're united together in action, we can create meaningful change. So our vision of building unity between land and sea and communities in solidarity with seafarers isn't just this idea or a concept, but it's really a call to action. As seafarers are uniting as one, making demands of their home governments, ship owners, and manning agencies to stand up for our rights, all of us on land can also unite alongside them to amplify their demands and make their struggles known.
Jessie and Cody, thank you so much for your presentation this morning. I was moved the first time you were here. I was even more moved this morning. You guys do such incredible work, and you're such incredible spokespeople. I'll go ahead and give one comment, and then I'll start with the first question as we await comments in the Zoom. I see one from Renga. I guess my comment, one of the things that struck me about the presentation, I mean, the seafarers are under such difficult conditions, and yet when you see the pictures, so many smiles, and I can't imagine, you know, Americans smiling after being treated like that. And I just wanted to get your comment on that, and then I'll go ahead and ask a question.
I mean, I think it speaks to, I mean, it speaks to a lot of what Tyler was saying. You know, these seafarers choose this, many of them, you know, seek this work out because it is the best work they could get, depending on regarding other work they could get at home, even though they are treated so awfully, and in a lot of cases make only a pittance of what they should actually be given. But they also they see the necessity in the work that they're doing, and they're very proud of what they do. And I think that that comes with a lot of inherent solidarity with each other. So even if they go through all this hardship, they know they have each other, and there is a sense of camaraderie. There is a sense of strength they find in that. And I think that, you know, especially when we come on these ship visits and we talk with them, it expands that sense of camaraderie. And they say, well, you know, the people we can rely on are more than just who we have on this ship. It also goes off the ship, and in many different countries we have people. So a lot of those smiles come from those interactions. It's not smiles of just accepting, like, you know, this is our lot in life, we might as well be happy. No, it is smiles of solidarity. It is smiles of strength. It is smiles, I think, of hope of what they could actually achieve for themselves and their families if we all work together. That's at least my take on it. I don't know if you have, okay.
Right. And my question is, before we get to the Zoom and live audience, this to me seems like a job for additional media to bring attention to the issue. In the old school media, maybe 60 Minutes. I don't know if 60 Minutes has ever done a story on this. And in the new school media, either like Trevor Noah, Kevin Hart, people with film companies that might be able to do a story on this, or influential social media people. We've seen some movement in labor unions and workers' rights since COVID. And I just feel like, you know, with the right social media influencer getting behind this, we could really bring attention on a global basis. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. We were actually able to take a journalist with the Northwest Labor Press on a ship visit, and she got to interview the seafarers. I'm sure we can maybe send a follow-up email with the link to that article. It was really powerful getting the seafarers' voices actually in a publication. So if you all have connections, any journalists, other media, we would love to continue along and take them on ship visits to expand.
Yeah, another project we're also projecting for the end of this year is we want to make a short film or documentary with some of our filmmakers from the Filipino Bayanihan Center who will actually highlight the stories of seafarers, get on the ships, interview the workers themselves. So hopefully that's something that we can get started at the end of the year and share. But if you know people who want to help get the word out, let us know.
Yeah, there's some there. I will be reaching out after the presentation. There's some people I know that might be able to help you even more. So
thank you very much for your graphic presentation of the problems of seafarers. And also we are gratified to hear about the work you are doing to alleviate some of their problems. I want to tell you about the other problem, namely, I understand that there are many ships all over the world which are abandoned by the owners for various reasons. And the crew in those ships are basically incarcerated for months and some of them for years even, and with no access to proper food, no medical care, and no communication with their families, etc. Now, how do we solve this problem or at least alleviate it? What can one do? It may be a small fraction, but the status is very pathetic.
That was a very great question. Unfortunately, it happens so much that companies will just straight up abandon their ships and leave their workers to fend for themselves, which often they can't, because if they don't have a visa, they can't leave the ship. And it's actually up to the company to bring them back home. Something we recently learned is that a shipping contract, goes for a certain amount of time, right? And so the company can say, oh, your 9 months is up. Fortunately, we couldn't get you back home, but I mean, that's the end of the contract. We can't provide you with anything more. Good luck. No, that's not true. The contract begins when the seafarers are leaving their home country. It ends when they are back home in their home country. And legally, the companies are responsible for them until they get back home. So this is it's not even a loophole, it's illegal, but the industry relies on us not knowing that. So an example actually of seafarers fighting back against this happened in Seattle a few months ago. And there was a picture we had during one of the slides Jessie was talking about that showed 6 seafarers holding up signs and having their fists in the air, showing their organized strength together. That is who we call the United Six. These were 6 seafarers out of a whole crew that were on a fishing vessel by a company called McAdams Fishing, and it abandoned their ship in Tukwila, Washington, and they were stuck on board. And the company said, "Well, there's not much more we can give you." And then the seafarers said, "No, that's not right." Luckily, they were able to connect with some family members who were on land there, and they got when they found out what was happening, they got them in touch with our local affiliates of Pacific Coast Coalition up in the Washington area and fought with them to help them get repatriated. And 6 of these seafarers are choosing to fight. They have a campaign to get back all of the wages that were stolen from them that they should have been given while they were abandoned. So this is actually a big example of how we fight back against what our friend just mentioned about companies leaving their ships. We work with the seafarers. It's the seafarers themselves who know this is wrong and are fighting with them. And the campaign for the United Six is such a powerful example of the workers at sea uniting with communities on land to wage a campaign for their rights and welfare together. So maybe also we can, when I said we would include the article when we follow up with an email or something after this, we can also include the recording to the community event that the United Six had, because it speaks to exactly what our friend just mentioned here.
Well, as an ex-sailor, I have some clue as to what they might be going through. How did you all get involved in this, and what does PCCS stand for again?
PCCS stands for the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers. I mean, I can speak to myself personally. Before we launched PCCS, I was already involved in human rights work for the Philippines, as were the many different members of PCCS were also involved in. Because of that work for years, we had actually been working with the ILWU, the Union of Longshoremen in the ports of both Portland and Vancouver, as well as our local ITF inspector. They would often approach our community organization saying, hey, this is the situation of Filipino seafarers in the port right now. And so even since back in 2016, our organizations would work with those unions and go on board ships, bring warm winter clothing, you know, whatever items they needed. But again, it was really during the start of the COVID pandemic when the conditions of seafarers got like drastically worse that we actually, as a bunch of different community organizations, decisively came together and launched a campaign for them and a permanent coalition. So that's my personal involvement, I think, similar for Cody. We have the like proper badging and requirements needed to get through the ports and get on board the ship. So most of the time now we're welcomed on board.
Sounds great. Let's go to question number 2.
My question may have been answered somewhere along there involving unions. You mentioned the journalist from a union magazine. What about the heads of American unions or maybe unions in other countries where these ships come from? Do you have any cooperation or contact with them?
Yeah, we work with a few different unions locally in Portland. I mentioned the ILWU. We just had a meeting with a member of UAW, the auto workers, yesterday. We brought Teamsters, New Season union workers, SCIU, janitorial workers, all on board ship visits, really on the basis of building international worker solidarity.
Letter carrier myself, and since we're in the business of shipping as well, I think we should probably I could probably give them a heads up on this.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you.
This is my channeling the DMV portion of the meeting. Let's go to question number 3.
You said these workers, they want to support their family. They want to give money to the family. So I keep wondering, how do they get paid? Do they have to wait until the end of their 9-month or 1-year contract to finally get money to their family? Or is there a way they can get money to their family during that contract period? How do they get paid, in other words?
Yeah, they usually get paid like monthly wage. I think they're, for the most part, paid hourly. They're contractual workers with an hourly wage. And so they're usually paid monthly or twice a month. But like I mentioned, specifically for Filipino seafarers, we've learned that they are required to send 80% of their salary per month back to the Philippines. And so a lot of the time, they're only maybe getting like, depending on what their salary is, $50 to a few $100s in hand while they're on board. And oftentimes they won't even get that part of their salary in hand on board. Maybe the captain will say they ran out of cash and so they're not actually able to pay them, which then leaves them like even more trapped on the ship, because if they don't get that salary, how can they pay for a taxi to go ashore? How can they buy groceries or anything they need?
So before we get to, is it question number 4 now? I'll go ahead and ask a question from the Zoom audience. So I have a good friend of mine that's high up in Doctors Without Borders. And in some ways, they're going into similar situations, the most war-torn countries, the most difficult of conditions, and doing surgeries and medical care. And they have a system of relief where they leave the country and then, you know, go home for a while and come back. So my question is, would it make sense to do some lobbying for doctors to be on board, because they could be kind of the external monitors of the ship conditions, and would that help publicize the issue?
Are you referring to like a doctor being on board for the full extent of the voyage?
Yes, or maybe there would be a way that there could be doctors coming on board for relief, like having doctors involved in the process might improve conditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have actually brought doctors, nurses, we have brought health workers on these ships before. Like Jessie mentioned, our health missions were have been a major part of our campaign. It's how we helped vaccinate over 5,000 seafarers in terms with our vaccination campaign because of such close relationships with health workers. One thing we have done a little bit and are trying to do more is do just general health checkups. So actually bring health workers on who can have stethoscopes, they can check blood pressure, because like what you're saying, they don't have access to any of this while they're at sea. So it actually is a very powerful way, I think, to connect with community, to bring health workers on to help with those checks.
I think also to just remember, like, while these workers are on the ship, it's the responsibility of their companies to provide medical care in any kind of medical emergency when it's needed. So in addition to the critical services that we do provide because of the severe neglect these workers are facing, we actually have to fight and advocate for companies to actually like follow the law and the rules. Like that's really their responsibility to ensure a doctor can get on board or a worker can get off the ship to see a doctor. So PCCS will work to fill the gaps, but at the same time, there really has to be a fight advocating for those basic rights that workers have in the face of these companies who will do whatever they can to evade any responsibility for their lives.
So we've established that many of the ship owners are violating many laws, and I know that there have been the occasional lawsuit, but it seems like that could be another tool that once these seafarers, have their leave, that lawsuits could be a process in making some headway here. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's also a good question. Like I mentioned in my part of the presentation, there are all these legal loopholes that the industry can use to get around this. So even if there was like a case we could bring up against the companies are totally protected. International law, there's all these ways to get around it. There are ways to prosecute, but again, if that's going to happen, we have to get around this flags of convenience loophole. Because if we go to prosecute a company for a labor abuse, they say, well, no, if you look at the laws in Panama, I'm just following that. So actually what we should be doing is pushing for international labor law to actually get stronger so we can bring those. Another way that this happens is that, again, on the international level, even just when we say international law, there's always that gray area about prosecution. It only is when governments willingly step up to enforce the law and they take that decisive action to commit to that it actually works. And so, therefore, a lot of international law, how it gets passed is a law is proposed and then different countries sign on to it. And there's no mechanism to force another country to sign on. If they don't sign on to it, they can just choose to not. And so one way that we're trying to push for this is there's something called now, is this the Maritime
Labor Convention?
Maritime Labor Convention that is a part of international law that country signatories are held to certain standards about labor protections for seafarers. The United States has not signed on to this. The United States, which is the benefactor of the majority of the shipping industry's profits, doesn't sign on to this basic law that says seafarers should be treated as humans. So before before we start thinking about how we can bring a lawsuit, we got to bring the law. We got to make sure the law can actually be enforced here at the ports in the U.S. And a big way to do that is to put pressure on the United States to actually sign the Maritime Labor Convention.
Yeah. The thing with international law is that, like Cody was saying, there's not clear mechanisms for its implementation. So it's actually up to us, the people, to push for and ensure its implementation, because a lot of these governmental and even intergovernmental bodies don't have clear mechanisms, or it doesn't even align with their interest to implement. So it's really up to the people to ensure they're implemented.
Okay. I think it was mentioned at the start of your talk that we're paying for all of this, and that the flow of consumer goods to us comes through this mechanism that is so oppressive. And I don't like to participate in those things. I try to direct my spending away from the bad guys and towards the good guys. And you haven't identified for us any way that we could possibly do that. Is it impossible? Are the bad guys so hidden in the depths, or are there people who own the bad guys that we could try to not invest in, or what? Where can we grab a hold of this as consumers and have any influence?
Yeah, well, I hate to break it for you, but in terms of like, if you're talking about like a boycott, that would mean you don't buy anything. Because again, this is the international shipping system we're talking about. It really it goes into everything you buy at the supermarket or the hardware store or anything like that. That's not just produced in like your backyard or your neighborhood.
People who are selling this stuff to us to find good characters instead of bad characters.
Even then, it's all bad characters who are monopolizing the whole shipping industry. So here's the good news, though. The good news is that even if we can't really vote with our dollar on this one, we can vote with our feet, which is, I believe, what Martin Luther King Jr. said. You can actually get out and take action. So that's more where the Pacific Coast Coalition focuses on, is saying that, these companies got it set. They knew exactly what they were doing. They know they are too big to fail. They know that they're going to be bailed out every time when any kind of bad press comes to them. They know that the kinds of economic activity that they carry is too much for any country to push without solid opposition from the people. So that's what it takes. And a big example that I can give of this goes back to what our friend mentioned about the role of unions. So there was actually one time when there was a ship with a full Filipino crew that came at the port, and the longshore workers, just in conversations they were having, found out from the crew that they had had all their wages withheld. They had not been paid at all. So what did the workers on land do? They talked with themselves, they were organized, and they went up to the ship and they said, we are not unloading the ship until you pay all your workers. And they did it. They had a sit down strike until those workers were paid. That's what voting with our feet looks like, I think. And so that's why everything that Jessie has said about what we as people do is so true. Governments won't sign on to these laws unless they see that there's a big enough and strong enough demand from their people, and we're not going to be silent until they do it. The same thing that happens about, fighting to get a seafarer without a visa on land to go have a life-saving treatment. We have to fight for that. So can't really speak to boycotting because the company has the upper hand on that one, but we can unite and use our power together as communities on land and sea, I would say.
Thank you for that story in an industry that doesn't have happy stories, and we're aiming to change this here. But let's go to question number 5.
I have several questions, but I'd like to ask 2 of my shorter ones. First of all, where was that article published that you talked about? Who published it?
Northwest Labor Press.
And secondly, you've mentioned a coalition, and so far the only other area that I've heard has worked in the coalition is in Seattle. But all up and down the West Coast, who are besides, and I know you're talking about labor unions as well as organizations like PCCS, but where else is that active?
Yeah, we are building PCCS chapters along the Pacific Coast. So it started here in the Portland, Vancouver area along the Columbia River. Our next strongest chapter is in Seattle, but we also have partners and affiliates in Northern California, so in the Bay Area, and we're also have perspective to build in Southern California as well. Community partners, again, range from like human rights groups, migrant organizations, environmental justice groups, unions, churches, and people of faith. It's very broad.
That's the hope, to go as far south as San Diego, as far north as Vancouver, and keep going wherever we can. Maybe even get to the Atlantic coast one day.
And that was going to be my segue or my question. Obviously, when it comes to seafarers, you've got the coasts on both sides of the country. So how much outreach has there been to the eastern seaboard ports so far as building a larger coalition?
You know, we've actually talked to some of our partners in the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area, especially after the Key Bridge collapse, that disaster, as well as some partners in New York. But if you know people in those areas who want to get involved, let's talk more.
Sounds good. Let's go to question number 6 at the Friendly House.
You mentioned about abandoning ship, that the shipping companies abandon a ship. I don't understand how they can abandon a ship. Could you help me understand that?
I mean, economically speaking, these are some of the most powerful companies in the world, and they sign it off as a loss, and that's okay. It's just like, okay, you know, that ship will sit idle for a few months, it's fine. And unfortunately, the crew is just considered an appendage of the machines on the ship. And it's similar. So I would imagine, I mean, I'm not a shipping company CEO. I can't get inside of their mind, but I would imagine their thought is just that this is just a way that they'll find another way to balance the books, and that's it, because that's the way that human value is treated to them. It's the same way as any kind of value. And in practice, what that looks like is, you know, ships get from any company can be just left anywhere in the world, because, you know, ships are used by different contracts. They're sometimes used by different companies. So they get passed around a lot. That's why they have to be registered. Each individual voyage is different. And so the company can just decide, like, oh, another company will take that ship. We'll just leave it where we were going to bring it home, but we'll leave it there for another 2 months. It's fine. And they don't think of the fact that they're leaving their workers there.
Yeah. And when they abandon it, it means that they literally stop thinking about the ship and the workers on it. So there's no more food supply, no more like fuel. So they can't even like run air conditioning on the ship. I've seen photos of seafarers having to sleep outside on the deck of the ship because it's so hot inside the ship. Not enough water, lack of like internet, so they can't communicate with their families. They're just completely stranded. And because they often don't have visas of the country that they're docked in, they literally cannot get off the ship. I read an article recently where the seafarers were saying, either get us off this ship or just let us die, because we can't stand this anymore, after being stuck on there for 7 months with no prospects for leaving.
Wow, that is awful. Let's go to question number 7.
All right, seafarer, does this include all those people who work on fishing boats, fishing factory boats out there on the ocean? I understand those are the conditions of some of the works.
Yeah, fishing vessels, even cruise ships. Also, some of the initial deaths of seafarers from COVID were on cruise ships. Actually, they evacuated all the passengers and they left the crew just to sit in a prison waiting to die on the ship. Right, yeah. But yeah, and I mean, again, the United Six that I mentioned, who were abandoned in Tequila, they were a fishing vessel. So it is the exact same conditions. And I believe actually in the international sphere, when you look at the totality of how seafarers are treated around the world, I think you're right, actually. The fishing industry is some of the worst, and actually utilizes straight up human trafficking, even more so than the cargo industry. So, but it's some across the board, any worker on any kind of ship, whether it's tourism, cargo, fishing, oil rigs, treated the same way.
And we have just enough time for another question from Joyce, from our studio audience, as we say.
What you made me wonder is, now I know of cases where migrants coming over from Mexico by land have been abandoned in trucks and all died. Has that ever happened at sea? And if so, I wonder if it would make enough of a fuss. It didn't make enough of a fuss with the migrants from Mexico.
Haven't heard of that happening, of like crew dying from being abandoned. Unfortunately, you know, the reason why migrants coming up from Central America die in those conditions are because of a lot of the same conditions that seafarers face when they're abandoned: heat, lack of food, lack of water. So even though we haven't heard of any conditions like that where a whole crew dying from abandonment, they died during COVID, and they die from accidents that are avoidable because it you know, the shipping, that the story I gave at the beginning about the storm and the cargo container falling loose and killing a seafarer, that company could have decided to make the economic loss the cargo ship, the cargo going into the water. They say, like, I'm willing to afford 3 of these containers falling in the water to protect my workers. And they decided the opposite. They decided, I'm willing to let my worker die, and then I don't have to pay him the rest of his wages over the cargo all getting to the destination. So I think that it's why we're very intentional when we call this presentation Forgotten Migrants at Sea, because ultimately these migrant workers on the sea face many of the same conditions as migrant workers, or even just any migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, anywhere, who are fleeing their home. They're not fleeing their home because they're choosing to. Seafarers don't just don't wake up one morning and say, I just want to be a seafarer because it sounds like a good job to do. It's because I have to do this. There's nothing else. There's no other livelihood for me at home. And unfortunately, many of those same migrants who are coming from Central America, if they're not facing violence, they're facing economic violence. I have to leave because I don't have this.
That's going to wrap up our Q&A. Jessie and Cody, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, for all your hard work, and for a spirited and enlightening Q&A. You are two of the best spokespeople doing incredible work, and we're always happy to see you, and we'll organize our group and see if we can help you even more.